cunning politics, and illicit love. Join us as the curtain rises on the passion plays of this Austrian citadel, next on Great Castles of Europe. Every spring, when the snow melts, the meadows of Austria's Salzburger province turn green once more. The Salzach River carries the icy waters of the Alpine glaciers to the city of Salzburg, named for the salt-rich mines that brought wealth to the region. In this town, layered in Baroque antiquity, Mozart was born, a native son revered to this day, though he himself never cared much for the confines of Salzburg's conservatism. Or perhaps it was this ominous sight, confronted every day, that put a damper on the young maestro's jaunty spirits. Looming imperiously above the city's old quarter stands one of Middle Europe's oldest and largest castles, Hohensalzburg. Towering 400 feet above the river, the castle casts a daunting silhouette against the sky, an arresting sight from miles afar. The castle is 900 years old, a symbol of medieval grandeur, a powerful statement of military might, lorded over by a handful of religious monarchs, the archbishops who governed the region during the reign of the Holy Roman Empire. The 12 archbishops who oversaw the castle for 8 centuries were a motley sort, some dedicated to matters of God and spirit, others who pursued more earthly delights, such as wealth, women, and war. They were a remarkable study in contrast and contradiction, whose stories spoke of arrogance and impudence, secret marriages and secret children, broken hearts and broken lives. Their colorful natures are forever entwined in the history of Hohensalzburg. For the most part, the archbishops used Hohensalzburg as a strategic fortress, a way to guard the city and control the trade and traffic that flowed between Italy and southern Germany. Certainly, the castle offered a menacing reminder to any interloper or enemy. Behind every tiny hole or tower window could lurk a set of watchful eyes, hands at the ready with poison-tipped arrows and withering cannon fire. The castle was originally built out of fear. In the year 1077, Archbishop Gebhard von Helfenstein began construction on the site as part of a 3-fortress line of defense. During a fierce power struggle between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor King Henry IV, the Archbishop had sided with the Pope. The specter of the king's revenge prompted the need to shore up his defenses. In the early days, Hohensalzburg looked much like the castle equivalent of a wooden shack, its simple construction made not of stone, but of wood. The man largely responsible for transforming Hohensalzburg into an impenetrable fortress was the Archbishop Leonhard von Keutschach. Ruler of Salzburg in the early 16th century, von Keutschach chose to live at Hohensalzburg, the only archbishop to prefer the castle's isolation over the hustle and bustle of the Salzburg city. Of course, other archbishops also lived here, but most of them divided their time between the castle on the hill and their mansions in town. It was von Keutschach who oversaw the construction of the castle's towers and defenses, giving it the impressive and forbidding posture it still holds today. The archbishop left his mark everywhere. His inscriptions and his coat of arms, bearing a sugar beet, are scattered throughout. 58 sugar beets in all. Von Koitschak's uncle is memorialized in this vegetable. He was a simple farmer who profoundly influenced the archbishop. Following an argument between uncle and nephew, the future churchman traded in his reckless days of youth, full of drunken escapades, and retreated to the castle to live a pious existence. Von Koitschak was a prickly, complicated archbishop whose harsh rule and deeply religious convictions did not endear him to the townsfolk. Few, though, would be foolish enough to test his ill temper or strength. He once disciplined a contrary servant by dangling him outside a castle window. Von Koitschak was also a stickler for order and discipline. He felt it his responsibility to wake the people of Salzburg every morning. He accomplished this by building an automated organ with a repertoire of melodies. It plays to this day music by the Mozarts, both father and son, and Joseph Haydn. Each melody ends with a startling roar, giving the instrument its name, the Salzburg Steer. During his days at Hohensalzburg, von Koitschak oversaw an extensive expansion that included the construction of several new buildings, among them a granary, brewery, weapon depots, a hospital, prison cells, dormitories, and of course, a chapel. Called St. George's Church, it houses life-size marble reliefs of the apostles, dressed like archbishops. The castle's expansion was a daunting, laborious task. Each boulder had to be hauled up the treacherous hill by oxen, horses, and prisoners. Von Koitschak grew impatient and ordered his engineers to invent a more efficient technique. The result, a cable car, one of the first in Austria. The cart ran on rails, pulled along by animals and men. Called the Long Journey, the cart passed through 4 solid walls of defense, each heavily guarded, and closed off by a set of heavy doors. Traveling uphill, von Koitschak could keep an eye on progress. Under his direction, Hohensalzburg grew from a simple wooden fortress to a 250-room stronghold that could, in times of tension, house 7,000 soldiers. A shrewd politician, von Koitschak consolidated great power over the Salzburger lands. He saw the castle as a symbol of his political and military strength. That strength was tested only once, with quite surprising results. Perhaps it was here, while looking over the city of Salzburg, that von Koitschak first heard the dangerous rumblings of rebellion from the townsfolk. Relations between the archbishop and the town had always been strained. With its own city council and mayor, Salzburg enjoyed its independence and looked on von Koitschak as a threat. By the 16th century, the city had grown rich from the thick veins of silver, gold, and salt that ran through the surrounding region. As the wealth grew, so did tensions. Whoever held political power also controlled the flourishing economy. On January 23, 1511, the City Council of Salzburg voted to oust Archbishop von Koitschak. but the Archbishop was not a man to be trifled with. Without wasting a moment, the Archbishop invited the entire council and the mayor to feast at his downtown residence. All his enemies attended, the council members, mayor, the city's secretary, even the judge. Spirits ran high, everyone certain that von Koitschak would have in hand a peace treaty to be negotiated over a good meal. But before his guests could manage their first bite, von Koitschak took them hostage. He would not release them until they ceded all city rights in perpetuity. The city lost its mayor and city council for good. It would never regain its autonomy, and the people of Salzburg would look up at the castle with hatred. For all his heavy-handed politics, von Koitschak's aesthetic style was quite delightful. The Archbishop oversaw the construction of the sumptuous staterooms. His bedroom is a good example of the rich Gothic design of the era. The best wood carvers of the Salzburger land were chosen to craft the fine details. Apart from the gold-imprinted leather walls, the rooms have been preserved in their original state. Remarkably, in its 900-year history, Hohensalzburg has remained unscathed by war, one of the few castles of Europe to hold that distinction. Its defenses were first tested in 1525, when the simmering frustration of the people of Salzburg finally boiled over. After centuries of uneventful intimidation, its garrisoned forces had to prove their mettle. It promised to be a baptism of fire. Much of Salzburg's seething discord was fueled during the reign of von Koitschak, who had stripped the city of its power and privilege 14 years earlier. Von Koitschak's successor, Archbishop Matthäus Lang, followed up with a measure of impudence. He named one of the castle's great watchtowers the Mayor's Tower, to mock the now mayorless city. His audacious act would not go unanswered. On the 25th of May, 1525, tens of thousands of city dwellers and farmers descended on the castle, screaming for an independent government and a return of Salzburg's privileges. But the fortifications built by von Koitschak held their own against the uprising. As the frustrated rebels did not dare attack the castle's defenses, they cut a tunnel out of the rock below and filled it with gunpowder. But the meager explosion made not a dent. Hohensalzburg, their much-hated symbol, simply rested on its rock, unfazed. The siege lasted the length of the summer of 1525. For the soldiers inside the castle, it was a season of boredom, spent watching the agitated rebels trying to work their pitiful wooden cannons, which often backfired. The rebellion eventually collapsed on itself, its only reminder, the scar of cannon fire inside the reception room. After the uprising, Hohensalzburg gradually faded in importance. Successive archbishops were drawn to the city and built homes and palaces in the town and nearby countryside. One archbishop in particular adored Salzburg and greatly influenced its architectural style. Wolf-Dietrich von Reichenau was a Renaissance man with strong ties to Italy. Raised in Rome during the 16th century, he fell under the powerful spell of Medici Florence. The archbishop held similar aspirations for Salzburg and did his best to transform the city into his own version of the Italian Renaissance, a Rome of the North. His crown jewel, the Mirabell Palace, Wolf-Dietrich built this home in 1606 for his beloved mistress, the beautiful Salome Alt. She bore the archbishop 15 children, and he later secretly married her. One might suppose that rumors of a Catholic archbishop fathering children and marrying a Jewish woman would have reached the Vatican, but they didn't. It was war that actually exposed Wolf-Dietrich's secret. The archbishop waged an ill-fated turf battle with neighboring Bavaria over salt deposits. The war ended in the archbishop's capture. Bavaria handed Wolf-Dietrich over to the Pope, who promptly imprisoned him after learning of his marriage. Wolf-Dietrich was jailed at Hohensalzburg, a prisoner, in fact, of his own castle. Stripped of his position, Wolf-Dietrich was now the ward of his nephew, the new archbishop, Marcus Siticus, who ignored his uncle's pleas for freedom. In 1617, after 5 years of imprisonment, Wolf-Dietrich died, legend says, of a broken heart. Wolf-Dietrich was the only prisoner of Hohensalzburg considered a celebrity. The others who filled the castle prison cells proved rather dull in comparison, ordinary poachers and common heretics. There is a torture room at Hohensalzburg that sits above the dungeon. It is, however, a piece of 20th century artifice. These unpleasant devices are imports from downtown, where they were put to quite effective use, one imagines, in the city jail. But the dungeon was always at Hohensalzburg, a dreary holding tank for prisoners through the centuries. It sank 16 feet deep. The bottom could be reached only by a rope that ran across the beams above. The dungeon walls are covered with engravings. Some resemble calendars, vertical lines scratched out to account for days past. Other etchings depict houses and names, perhaps desperate attempts to hold on to one's identity or keep a fierce grip on sanity, as prisoners would be kept here in the dark for at least 6 weeks before questioning even began. As the 17th century progressed, Hohensalzburg lost much of its significance, while the archbishops built livelier homes in and around town. Most notable was the Hellbrunn Palace, built by Marcus Siticus. Like much of Salzburg, the palace showed a strong Medici streak. The villa and gardens clearly resembled the style of Frascati and Tivoli. And inside Hohensalzburg, life continued, but now without archbishops. Within the gloomy confines of Hohensalzburg lived only soldiers who battled mostly against their own boredom. By the 18th century, the fortress had lost much of its military character. The archbishops no longer wielded political influence, and new arms and war strategies had rendered the fortress defenses obsolete. The spiritual life at the castle suffered too. An 18th century chaplain wrote, "The fortress now counts 341 souls, of which only 7 are baptized. I am worried about the carelessness of the parents. I only see strangers in church." The fortress soon fell into disrepair, but fortunately plans to demolish the structure were interrupted in the mid-19th century when preservationists moved to make the fortress a museum, a medieval relic of a colorful and turbulent past. Anyone today can trace the footsteps of the archbishops, their pious ways, and their trespasses. This secret staircase ends not far from the castle. Legend has it that the hidden passage was built and used by one of the archbishops for clandestine meetings with his concubines in town. For more than 100 years now, visitors have come to Hohensalzburg to plunge into the lives and adventures of such characters as Wolf Dietrich and von Keutschach, to explore the secret pits and passages of this medieval wonder, and to better learn the compelling drama of passion, politics, and religion that ran from the early Middle Ages to the late Renaissance.